Liverpool, England, 1957. A summer church festival in Woolton was about to change music history forever. On July 6th, a 15-year-old John Lennon was performing with his skiffle group, the Quarrymen, when his friend Ivan Vaughan introduced him to a 14-year-old Paul McCartney. After the show, Paul impressed John by playing Eddie Cochran's 20-Flight Rock perfectly on guitar, even nailing all the lyrics. Despite his cool exterior, John was blown away. Here was someone who could possibly match his own musical talent. A few weeks later, Paul joined the Quarrymen. Not long after, Paul suggested adding his friend George Harrison to the mix. At first, John thought George was too young, just 14 at the time. But when George jumped on a bus with them and played raunchy perfectly, John changed his mind on the spot. The core of what would become the Beatles was forming. The group went through several name changes: Johnny and the Moondogs, the Silver Beatles, and finally, the Beatles. The name was John's idea, inspired by Buddy Holly's band, the Crickets, with a twist on the word beat. Early drummer Pete Best joined in 1960, just before their first Hamburg trip. Hamburg changed everything. Playing 8 hours a night in rough clubs like the Kaiser Keller and Star Club, they transformed from rough around the edges amateurs into a tight professional unit. We had to learn millions of songs, George later recalled. We'd be playing to sailors who'd request all kinds of stuff. By the time we left Hamburg, we could play anything. Back in Liverpool, they began regular lunchtime sessions at the Cavern Club on Matthew Street. Word spread quickly about this incredible band that could play rock and roll like nobody else. The crowds grew larger, the screaming got louder, and soon the cavern was packed wall to wall for every Beatles show. Local record store owner Brian Epstein caught their act in November 1961. As he watched the leather-clad quartet own the stage, he had one thought: they're going to be bigger than Elvis. Early success in UK, Brian Epstein's prediction wasn't far off. After signing on as their manager, he cleaned up their image, replacing leather with suits, and began shopping them to record labels. Though they faced rejection after rejection, including an infamous "guitar groups are on their way out" comment from Decca Records, Epstein persisted. Finally, on June 6, 1962, the Beatles auditioned for producer George Martin at EMI's Parlophone label. Martin saw potential, but suggested one significant change: replacing drummer Pete Best. Enter Ringo Starr, who joined in August 1962, completing the iconic lineup we know today. Their first single, Love Me Do, released in October 1962, peaked at number 17 on the British charts. Not bad for a debut, but what came next was extraordinary. Their second single, Please Please Me, soared to number 1 in early 1963, with George Martin telling them after the recording, "Gentlemen, you've just made your first number 1 record." The success led to their debut album, Please Please Me, recorded incredibly in just one day, February 11th, 1963. The marathon session concluded with John Lennon battling a cold, absolutely shredding his vocal cords on Twist and Shout in what would become one of rock's most iconic performances. Beatlemania exploded across Britain. Their next singles, From Me to You and She Loves You, dominated the charts. By October 1963, the hysteria reached new heights when the band appeared on Sunday night at the London Palladium, causing chaos on the streets of London as thousands of fans tried to catch a glimpse of them. Their second album, With the Beatles, released in November 1963, sold an unprecedented 500,000 copies before it even hit the shelves. The cover photo, those 4 half-shadowed faces, became instantly iconic. The Beatles didn't just dominate the British charts, they revolutionized what was possible in popular music. As John Lennon later reflected, "We were just a band who made it very, very big. That's all. But very, very big in Britain was just the beginning. America was calling, and what happened next would change popular culture forever." Global breakthrough. February 7th, 1964. Pan Am Flight 101 touched down at New York's JFK Airport, greeted by over 3,000 screaming fans. The Beatles had arrived in America, though they weren't entirely sure what to expect. "Will we be big in America?" they'd asked their press officer. They got their answer 2 days later. On February 9th, an estimated 73 million Americans, about 40% of the total population, tuned in to watch the Beatles perform on The Ed Sullivan Show. It remains one of the largest television audiences in history, with Paul's head shaking "yeah, yeah, yeah" during She Loves You and John's playful bow after I Want to Hold Your Hand. They conquered America in just 13 minutes. The timing was perfect. America was still healing from from President Kennedy's assassination just months earlier, and the Beatles brought exactly what the country needed: joy, excitement, and something entirely new. Their first US single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, had already hit #1, and within 2 months they held all 5 top spots on the Billboard Hot 100, a record that's never been broken. The film, A Hard Day's Night, followed in July 1964, revolutionizing music movies. What could have been a cheap cash-in turned into a critically acclaimed, innovative piece of cinema that influenced everything from music videos to modern documentary style. The title song, written overnight at director Richard Lester's request, showcased their growing songwriting sophistication. Their first world tour was a marathon of hysteria. In every city, scenes repeated, screaming fans, police barricades, hotels under siege. They played concerts where they couldn't even hear themselves over the crowd noise. Help became more than just their second film title. It was genuinely how they felt. By 1965, their music was evolving rapidly. Yesterday, recorded with just Paul and a string quartet, showed they were more than just a rock band. Norwegian Wood introduced the sitar to pop music. The album Rubber Soul, released in December 1965, marked a turning point. Complex lyrics about adult relationships, innovative recording techniques, and a cohesive album approach that would influence countless artists, including their friendly rivals, the Beach Boys. The Beatles had achieved more in 2 years than most bands do in a career, but for John, Paul, George, and Ringo, this was just the beginning. Their most creative and revolutionary period was still to come, as they prepared to leave live performance behind and push the boundaries of what popular music could be. Creative peak years. By August 1966, the Beatles had made a dramatic decision. They were done with touring. Their final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco marked the end of an era. We were fed up with playing those little shithouses with crap gear and stupid people fighting, George Harrison later said. Now they could focus entirely on studio work, and what came next would change music forever. Revolver, released just before their final tour, showed what was possible when the Beatles spent real time in the studio. Songs like Tomorrow Never Knows featured tape loops, backward guitars, and electronic effects that were revolutionary for 1966. John's lyrics had evolved from She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah to Turn Off Your Mind, Relax, and Float Downstream. Then came their masterpiece. Starting in November 1966, the Beatles spent over 400 hours creating Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. They weren't just recording songs, they were painting with sound. George Martin and engineer Jeff Emmerich pushed the technical boundaries of what Abbey Road's 4-track equipment could do. A Day in the Life ended with a 40-piece orchestra climbing to a chaotic crescendo and that thunderous final piano chord that seemed to last forever. Sgt. Pepper was more than an album. It was a cultural moment. The elaborate cover, the printed lyrics, the cutout inserts, everything about it was revolutionary. The Times of London declared it a decisive moment in the history of Western civilization. Even the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson, upon hearing it, pulled his car over and cried, knowing his own masterpiece, Smile, had been trumped. The Summer of Love followed, with the Beatles as its soundtrack. All You Need Is Love was broadcast live to 400 million people worldwide via satellite, the first global television link. They were now at the absolute peak of their creative powers, but things were changing. Brian Epstein's sudden death in August 1967 removed their steady managerial hand. Their exploration of transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi marked a spiritual turning point. The magical mystery tour of psychedelic innovation was coming to an end, though nobody knew it yet. The Beatles had pushed pop music into the realm of art, but personal tensions were growing. As John later reflected, we were 4 guys who really loved each other and proved that it could work, but even the Beatles had to split up. Final years. The sessions for what became the White Album in 1968 marked the beginning of the end. Engineer Jeff Emmerich quit during recording, unable to handle the tension. Rather than working as a unit, the Beatles often recorded separately, yet somehow they still created brilliant music. While My Guitar Gently Weeps featured Eric Clapton on guitar, Helter Skelter pushed the boundaries of heavy rock. Blackbird showcased Paul's delicate songwriting. January 1969 brought the infamous Let It Be sessions. Originally planned as a return to roots album and film, the project instead documented a band falling apart. George Harrison temporarily quit the band, walking out after an argument with Paul. "I'm leaving the band now," he said simply. When he returned, they brought in Billy Preston on keyboards, whose presence helped ease the tension. The legendary rooftop concert on January 30th, 1969 would be their final final public performance. For 42 minutes, the Beatles played atop their Apple Corps building in London, drawing crowds on the streets below until the police shut it down. John's final words, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition," became unknowingly historic. In a last burst of unity, they gathered at Abbey Road Studios to create their true final album. Abbey Road was a masterpiece, featuring the famous Side 2 medley and gorgeous harmonies on Because. The cover photo of the four crossing Abbey Road became iconic. The end provided a fitting finale, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. The Beatles officially ended in April 1970 when Paul announced his departure. Legal battles followed. The press painted it as a bitter feud, though the reality was more complex. They had simply grown in different directions. As Ringo later said, "We were just lads who were friends who got successful. Then we got very successful, and that put pressure on the friendship. The dream was over, but the music remained." Their final album showed a band still capable of greatness, even as they were falling apart. The Beatles ended at their peak, leaving behind a legacy that would influence generations. Legacy and impact. The numbers alone tell an incredible story. The Beatles have sold over 600 million records worldwide. They hold the record for most #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100 with 20 singles. Their influence extends far beyond statistics though. As Paul McCartney said, "We were just a band who made it very, very big, that's all." But that modesty understates their revolutionary impact on popular culture. Every member had significant success after the Beatles. John's Imagine became an anthem for peace. Paul's Wings soared through the 70s. George's All Things Must Pass proved his songwriting prowess. Ringo continued making music and touring with his all-star band. Their music remained strikingly relevant. When their catalog finally hit streaming services in 2015, a new generation discovered them. Here Comes the Sun has over 1 billion streams on Spotify. Their influence echoes through modern music, from Oasis to Taylor Swift. Paul McCartney's 2022 Glastonbury headlining set proved their songs still unite generations. The innovations they pioneered are now industry standards. They revolutionized studio recording techniques, album artwork, music videos, and concert performances. Every band that writes their own songs, every artist who sees albums as artistic statements, every musician who pushes technical boundaries, all follow in the Beatles' footsteps. In 2021, Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary showed the band in a new light, revealing the joy and creativity behind even their difficult final days. It reminded the world that beneath all the mythology, the Beatles were four friends who changed music forever while having the time of their lives. Today, the Beatles' influence is everywhere. When Billie Eilish headlines Glastonbury or Taylor Swift releases a surprise album, they're following a path the Beatles blazed. Every TikTok user who discovers In My Life or Here Comes the Sun proves these songs are timeless. The music still feels fresh. Listen to the harmonies on Because. The raw energy of Helter Skelter or the orchestral grandeur of A Day in the Life. They could have been recorded yesterday. As each generation discovers the Beatles, they find something new. Perhaps that's their greatest legacy. Not just changing music, but creating something that continues to evolve and inspire. And hey, if you're just discovering the Beatles now, you're in for an incredible journey. Maybe you found them through Peter Jackson's Get Back, or heard Come Together in a movie, or your parents played Hey Jude on a road trip. Whatever brought you here, you're part of a story that keeps growing. What's your favorite Beatles song? Let me know in the comments below.